Hey everyone, this is Melky, your host, with another episode of Meaningful Conversations with Talk Calls. And today's episode is one that truly embodies the spirit of connection, resilience, and humanity. Our guest today is the phenomenal Marion, a woman who has dedicated her life to building resilience for refugee workers, supporting mental health in displaced communities, and providing care for those navigating unimaginable trauma. From consulting on mental health for refugee children to designing CPD certificate training programs for churches and organizations, Marion's work is nothing short of extraordinary. In this episode, we'll delve into her groundbreaking projects and her reflections on what it means to bring care to the front lines of human displacement. If you have ever wondered how you can make a difference in the lives of those affected by crisis, this is the episode for you. Let's dive in. Hello, welcome, Marion. Welcome to Meaningful Conversations with Top Calls. How do you feel today?
Feel quite good, actually. It's quite cold here in London, but it's crisp cold, which is good.
It's also very cold here in my country, in India.
Well, there you go.
So, Marion, how would you like to introduce yourself to our audience and what do you do?
Okay, so in terms of what do I do now, I work mainly with refugee organisations, NGOs working with refugees, migrant kids, and in this country too, I chair a network of 1,500 churches working with refugees. I'm also an intercultural trainer for business people moving across countries, so that's another area altogether. And also working in the area of post-traumatic growth and burnout and things with people who are involved with compassionate ministries, and particularly at the moment, running a course twice a year into Ukraine on how to receive a soldier back from war. So it's varied.
All right, that's a very incredible work you're doing, Marion, and it's very human-centered. The work and the approach is very human-centered. I would like to focus especially on your work within refugee communities.
Right.
And the world is going through a tremendous refugee crisis. And as per UNHCR, this is the highest in 2024. I think the world has seen the refugee crisis, which has been the highest in the history, I guess, because of the war, because of climate refugees. So these refugees arrive in countries where they do not speak the local language, making communication and integration difficult. So how do you help them in communicating and integrating in a new lifestyle, in a completely new culture?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think we need to distinguish. There are asylum seekers and refugees. So most people coming to a country are asylum seekers, and then they have to wait to get refugee status, which is another one of the incredible frustrations for them. They think they've escaped everything bad that's been happening to them, and suddenly they're in a land where they're lost, isolated, don't speak the language, but have to deal with legalities, hospitals, medical things. So it's a huge thing that they're facing. And as opposed to all the other migrant children I've dealt with, all of these families have a history of trauma either. And it's not just the trauma that was in the place that you left, but often traumatic things on the journey, those that have been in refugee camps or on crossings. So the children have seen things that no child should see. The parents themselves are traumatized. So one of the big things we're dealing with when families arrive is that parents are not in a place where they can take care of their children because they themselves have got to deal with their own trauma. So one of the things that we do when they come, when we're engaging with them, once they've sort of arrived wherever we are, inverted commas, is to try and set up help for the parents to be able to work through their trauma and set up care for the children in the meantime. So the family stays together, but while the parents are having stuff help, you have sessions with the children. And of course, with children, younger children cannot express, they don't have the language for dealing with what. So it comes out in behavior. And so there's a great place for storytelling and art and that sort of thing with the children. So it's keeping children safe, beginning to get them to a place where they can feel that they can let out some of this stuff that's inside them, and giving the parents space to be able to deal with their issues and then move in. Although, of course, as well as being isolated in the country they're coming to, the cultures are often very different. And of course, culture informs how we parent. You parent very differently in India to the way perhaps people parent in Brazil or wherever, Philippines. So you've got all sorts of adaptations that are going on because obviously we're trying to get children into normality in schools, and then schools have their own way of behavior that you must do. And sometimes that contravenes what parents think they should do, especially if you've got a shame on a culture or a culture where teens are separated, in terms of their gender when they get to about 12. And British schools are all inclusive. And I can well remember we had over 400 Afghans in hotels in my town, a rolling number, so way more. And we put lots and lots of activities. We put a teens night on. And in the end, we had to stop it because the teenage boys were getting very cross with each other when they thought that the boy was looking at his sister. And you can't look at her like that. And that was just something that was not usual to their culture for them to mix. Sorry, that's a very long-winded sentence. But it's complicated.
You mentioned Afghan refugees and they are Syrian refugees. Maybe can you share one of these stories, or from your experience, maybe a story about any of the refugees who were facing this issue of trauma response or perhaps cultural dislocation, and how your training or how your work helped them overcome these complexities?
I've got a story that it's not my personal one, but it mirrors several stories that we kind of had, because often ended up going into schools to advocate on behalf of the children. So let me just tell you the story about Rachel, who came from Africa. She was the fifth child in the family when the war broke out. Many families were killed. And her mother walked for a month to a refugee camp in Kenya when Rachel was 2. So this is Rachel's background. When she's 4 in the camp, she's molested by a relative. Tried to tell her parents, her family about it, but was told never to mention it because of the shame. And she experienced a lot of violence and suffers from mental illness. Her mother's mainly bedridden, unable to comfort her. They migrate to the West when she's 10, and she started having problems at the school who called her name because of her accent, her clothes. So she got into fights and suspension. Her mother started arguing with her because she was acting in a way that wasn't appropriate to her culture. So there was physical fighting within the family. Mother complained to the community, and they were evicted from their housing and lost housing benefit because of Rachel's behaviour. Mother hadn't passed citizenship, and Rachel left school after being put in a place that was unsuitable to her academic level. Now, children like Rachel, what we know is, let's put a little caveat in here, is that the studies have shown that about 5 years after arriving in a country, we start getting problems with the children. We start getting bad behaviour. And then, of course, the school labels them as the naughty child, so then they start getting excluded. And nobody thinks to examine, well, why is this child suddenly behaving badly? And it's the trauma that's you think about this child. All right, okay, molested when she was 4, can't talk about it because who is she going to talk about it to? How is she ever going to open? And I think what we found with certainly with the girls, well, actually with the women as well, was we needed to find a space for private conversations where they could open up, because we had a lot of people from a shame on a culture in the one place. So everybody was keeping eyes on everybody else. And with a shame on a culture, of course, you don't open up. So Rachel needed an advocate. She needed personal care, somebody who would take care of us. And I can think of kids that we took out to do things, as well, of course, the fact that her mother needed help, the family needed help. But Rachel herself needed somebody to listen to her, to take her seriously, and to advocate on her behalf in the school. She shouldn't have been left to deal with that. And one of my struggles is that I tried to get into local schools to try to explain to the teachers what refugee trauma looks like. Because most teachers didn't know that. They didn't have the cultural knowledge of a shame on a culture. So they had no way of processing it. And we're into a huge, I don't know, I'm talking about England, issue of we are a multicultural society, but there's not enough given to people who are working within communities to help them understand the culture. Doctors, nurses, teachers all need to understand that side of things.
Thank you for sharing that. Sometimes in schools, they separate the kids because the kids are naughty, but they don't identify that why kids are naughty because of the trauma, and that's how it's manifesting. So before, I worked with refugees for a bit short amount of time when I was teaching them English as a second language. Before that, I used to think that they do not go through these issues because for them, they just need basic things like food and shelter. And I believe there are a lot of people who actually think like that. But when I work with them, it changed my perspective that the issues are beyond just providing basic food and shelter. How do you think people can change that perspective, especially when it comes to working with refugees and especially when it comes to identity and belonging?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see, certainly within our system, that there was a means of going into schools just to explain the nature of childhood trauma and how it affects. I mean, what we know is that childhood trauma has long-term effects for a child. It affects their emotional development, their behavior, their ability to self-regulate, which is something you learn when you're a child. But if you're in a traumatic situation, you don't learn self-regulation. Their sense of self, because where is this identity? You know, I am not Afghan, I am not British, I don't know where. I mean, kids that travel on business have identity issues, but they've all got a passport to a country they're going to go back to. These children do not have the right, in a sense, to be anywhere. So it really is understanding the effects of trauma that just go on and on. I mean, one person talked about it having a cascading damaging effects through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So I'm not a psychologist. We can't all be psychologists, but we can learn what we call psychological first aid, which it means that you have enough of a knowledge to know that what I see here, what I hear here is not normal, and the person needs help with it, and they need help to process it. So what we need most of all, I think, are good listeners, people who can listen. You can't fix people, but you can listen. And listening actually validates the person, validates their experience, and it helps to have a little bit of this background when you're listening. And also, as a little caveat, to know when what you're listening to is kind of above your grade and the ability to deal with it. If you know, there are red flags that say this is not just inverted commas, a trauma, but actually we have a serious mental illness manifesting itself, and I need to pass this person on to the right authorities. Because it takes a long time for a refugee to get access to healthcare, particularly mental health care. Many, of course, in the cultures we're talking about, admit to mental illness is actually a shame issue in itself. So mental illness is very much brushed under the carpet, as we say in English.
That is absolutely true. Especially, I think it's very prominent in my country. It's still considered as a stigma.
Yep.
There's a prejudice behind mental health issues and trauma, and when we talk about and the past experiences and the violence and the displacement, and then you mentioned the stress of resettlement. So they're running away from the problem, but now they are just hanging in between, and that contributes to mental health challenges.
Absolutely. And how do you give people permission to deal with all of that? And some of it I found because I do a lot with international parents on international parenting, and we talk about, well, what's at the basis of good parenting that's not necessarily transcended by culture. I mean, every culture will have different things, but there's a pyramid done of good parenting, and it begins with, you know, safety and security, but it ends up with unconditional love, that I love you no matter what you do. You don't have to earn my love as a parent. And actually, I found with several cultures I've taught that into, that's been a new thing, or even expressing love as a parent. But you have to extrapolate where the cultural stuff came in. I mean, one of the things we had with our Afghan guests was that the way of disciplining a child was physical discipline. Now, of course, that's illegal in England. It's not just not cultural, it's illegal. So you've got a huge education process to get through because parents hit the kids, big kids hit the little kids, and it just cascades down. And then, of course, they get to school and they're starting to do it there. So these are not simple problems. There's no quick fix to this problem. And you say about mental illness, yeah, there are lots of cultures where it's still a stigma. And how do we remove that? How do we give people permission? And partly it's people speaking out and saying about their own, problems that they had. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's any easy solution to it. But as I say, I think for lay people like you and I, knowing the basics and coming alongside people like you did with those kids, you come alongside, you listen, and there are tools that you can help work through. There are some really good ones around about how you can listen to children, how you can help people to do some processing and walking them through that. And walking them through, a lot of a child's anger is not really anger, it's grief. What they've lost, they've lost their friends, they've lost their home, they've lost their language, they've lost their community. And I think somebody once said it's easier to be angry than to grieve. So often anger cloaks grief. And so if you're addressing the anger, you're not getting at the root of it. But actually, if you're getting to the grief that's there and helping them process grief and to be able to express grief and asking, how is that done culturally in this way? How do you express grief in your culture? And of course, it's very much community culture, lots of these cultures. You don't go in a room on your own. You do it together. And I think that's been quite powerful when we've managed to, in small groups sometimes, or often an individual, get people to open up to what they've lost.
I do agree with what you stated, that anger is a symptom of grief. And sometimes people just tend to fix the symptom, not knowing what's the root cause of the problem. And how do we fix that? I'm not sure. It can take a decade or two sometimes to fix that, or sometimes it's not even fixed. But what we can do, I believe, is providing safe spaces within community. And how we can do is by what you stated, by listening to people. Sometimes people just need someone to talk to.
It's been very interesting, actually, just interrupting you, doing this course into Ukraine, because we talk about post-traumatic growth, which is the idea that you can actually be stronger after a trauma, or you don't mention it to the person while they're in the trauma, but there's this whole thing, the idea that when you're in that place of having cascaded down a slope with all your illusions shattered, everything that was safe taken away from you before you can climb up the other side. How do you ruminate? How do you process at the bottom? And with the adults, we've been teaching them the art of lament, how to lament, which is a very, very powerful tool. And I had one lady who we did it 7 till 9 o'clock at night, Ukrainian time, and I got an email through from her at 10 o'clock my time, which was midnight. And she said, it was wonderful. I was so angry and I let it all out, she said. I've got so much energy to do housework, even though it's late at night. And I thought, well, I don't know about that. With children, there are things that you can do. If you start drawing faces, you have a lot of faces, with different expressions. Which one is you at the moment? And they might circle several. They're excited to be in the new place, but they're sad. And having a first aid box for kids. Where do you go when you're sad and things? What's in your first aid box? Well, I have my teddy that I get out, or of course that might have been lost on the journey, but what can kids do to help themselves, and finding those age appropriate things for you. It's much more complicated with teens, obviously, usually the really angry ones.
Sometimes I think these small activities can help them acknowledge what they are going through, because sometimes putting a label to it that, okay, I'm going through grief and I need to process that, I think it helps. So acknowledging these activities can help them realize and acknowledge it.
There's an interesting book. I think it's only in English, but it's called How Are You Peeling? And it's about an onion. You take the layers off, and each layer is a an emotion, and you work kind of through it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I always give an example of onion. It's the best example whenever it comes about grief, trauma, and identity and belonging. Talking about refugees, I believe, and I have seen through my own experience, that refugees encounter prejudice and hostility because of discrimination and xenophobia that further hinder their sense of belonging and identity.
Yep.
So what we can do as community to remove that discrimination and that xenophobic mindset?
Yeah. I think, well, for me, it's always, I work with refugees because it's the right thing to do, not because I've got no secondary agenda to it. There are lots of things I want for them, but my chief agenda is because it's the right thing to do. So within our next, I said we've 1,500 churches trained and equipped to welcome refugees. So we have separate things on Ukrainian welcome, Afghan welcome, Hong Kong welcome, which have been the big ones. We've got a book now in Cantonese for children. We've got one coming out in Dari for Afghans. So it's really, I think, we go back to again, it's an education process. And so part of it, I think, is preparing the refugees themselves to say, you may not always be welcome. We welcome you, we love you, but that won't be true of everyone here. That's the reality you're going to face. Being influential in your local authority. So where I live, the pastor of my church has made a really good relationship with the mayor of the city. Were invited by the city to do things for refugees. The organisation I work for was invited by the government to partner with them for the Afghan arrivals because we'd done such a good job with the Hong Kongers. So I think influencing your community, I think, is a good thing. Even at dinner tables, sometimes you have to put people right when they come up with their prejudices. And then it's, I think, awareness. And what tools can you give them about trying not to react too much? I think that's important. Helping them to understand British culture. Often it's just a misunderstanding that happens, and then they do themselves damage. I mean, we have an expression in English, when in Rome, do what the Romans do. I say, when in Rome, know what the Romans do and adapt your behaviour. So just as I used to with businessmen, same with refugees, you have to teach them. Now, this is norms. This is what British appreciate. We always queue. Please don't push into a queue, or they will say something about you being whatever nationality you are. But, education is a great thing if you can educate that community, and then don't stay away from, get involved in the local community and make a difference there by helping them understand, and then put on activities. That's what we found. I mean, English language classes, I can't think of how many of those we run. And often for mums who can't get out of the house, have not been used to getting out of the house, but they can come, toddlers looked after, mums learn English. Days out, we had men's evenings. We put on football for them, cricket, all sorts of things. I mean, sport's a great leveller. And certainly for our case with the Afghans, they're very good at cricket. So the local cricket club took them on. And provided them with bats and things, some of them, because they were really good. So, and how much can you, rather than doing things yourself, whoever you might be, linking them to things that's already happening in the community? Is there a football club? Is there, I don't know, singing or music, or what other things are going on in your community that, not that you could send them to, but that you could take them to, which will help them integrate with the local community. And of course, hospitality is a big, big thing, having them in your home. And certainly for when we had the Afghans here, and they were locked up in the hotel, but they couldn't look after themselves at all. So we opened up our hall and had the ladies down at least once a month to do Afghan cooking. And they were as happy as it. Thank you so much for letting us cook and wash up. I said, you can come and do my washing up anytime you like. But I think that's, it's facilitating integration.
And that's very holistic approach. It's a very human-centric approach, not forgetting that they are also human. Let's forget about nationality or a culture for a moment. We all are human, and they are living a human experience which is similar to ours. Maybe the culture is different, maybe the nationality is different. In the end, we all are humans. I mean, that basic,
Yes.
fundamental, if integrated in our mindset, we can remove the xenophobia and discrimination.
I think, too, on the other side of the equation for us, there was a certain amount of education going the other way, because most certainly, I'm staying with the Afghans here, they'd been working for the British government, they'd got really nice big houses, good lifestyle, and then they come to England, where we all live in sort of, 3-bedroom terraced houses or whatever. There isn't a lot of space in England. You have to be very, very rich to have a big house. And so open the eyes to the reality that life will be different here, because I've left this very, I saw some of the pictures and they were just wonderful, but the reality was that wasn't going to happen here. And coming to an acceptance of that, I think, was quite important. Otherwise, their expectations were not real. And they might lead people to resent them because they had those expectations. Does that make sense?
So, Marion, I would also like to talk about the book you have written, Burn Up or Splashdown, Surviving the Re-Entry of the Culture Shock
All
of
right.
Re-Entry.
Yeah.
And I can totally resonate to that book, because when I came back to my country after having lived abroad for a few years, I went through a culture shock within my own country.
Yeah.
And I couldn't acknowledge that. I couldn't comprehend at that point of time, because I feel like I grew up in this culture, and why I'm going through this culture shock, I don't understand. When I told
Yeah.
this to my friends and they started making fun of me, it's like, dude, you grew up like this is your own culture. But one of my cousins who lived in the US, she calls me and it's like, hey, how's the culture shock? I was like, damn, she understands it. And then I read your book, which you gave me when we met in Thailand. And I read that book and I can totally resonate to what you have written in your book. So, what's your perspective about surviving the culture shock of re-entry? And you have lived in different cultures in a different countries. What was your culture shock and how did you survive it?
I think what is interesting is we say going home, but you're not going home. Most people, especially they've been away, they're leaving home actually when they go back to their passport culture. And one of the problems is that people think, well, I'm from there, so I'll just fit back. The reality is that while you've been away, you've changed. So here we are, you've changed and gone in this direction. But actually, things at home and people at home have also changed and gone in this direction. So what was a little gap like this is now a big gap like that. And you've been changed by your experience. You now have a different worldview. You're probably more resilient, all sorts of things. And meanwhile, life has gone on at home. And when I was doing the research for the book, the biggest thing that came up, when I said, what were your biggest challenges, was the ability to tell your story. No one was interested in my story. Everybody would say, oh, so how was it in Colombia? And you'd say something, and within 5 minutes, the eyes had glazed over and they were switched off. And then somebody said to me one time, Marion, you don't get 5 minutes, you get 2. So I always say to people, when you're going back, prepare 2 sentences, and that for most people will be enough. But you've got a story, and you need to find somebody who can share that story with. So it will be somebody who, after you've said the 2 sentences, follows up with another question and wants to know more. And I find that most people I know that come back, when they get back, they get involved with some sort of international community. So for many years, I was involved with international students. And the number of people who helped out with our international students events in the UK, who had themselves lived overseas or grown up overseas if they were students, was quite a high percentage of our volunteers came from that. Because finally, here was somebody who got me. Here was somebody who understood that the word didn't end at the English Channel or whatever. And it was very interesting that my story wasn't valued. And again, grief, you see, that's another one. People would say, oh, aren't you glad to be back? I bet you're glad to be back, not to be there anymore with that thing, And the number of people said, no, I wasn't glad to be back. I missed everything. I missed the food. I have a daughter-in-law who grew up in Thailand, and she loves Thai food, and she cooks great Thai food. But that's the sort of little things, if you like, food. But they're the things that kind of encapsulate what life was like there. And so there is a lot of grief, and most people aren't given space to grieve. Aren't you glad to be back? Well, let's get you a job and let's get you started off again. There's no space. We started running re-entry holidays for teens. I don't know when I started it, 15 or more years ago. And the first time I did it, I had 8 teens there talking about who had been home from everything from 1 week to a couple of months. And I did a session of memory bags. They had to bring a memory bag with 3 things, I think it was 3 or 4 things, of their time overseas, And I thought 8 people, well, just over an hour. 2 hours later, we're still going because finally there's somebody else that's interested in their life story. We had all sorts of things, the signed T-shirt, the mug, I don't know. But, here was a place where you could process and where everybody understood what you were talking about. I mean, they said you didn't have to explain yourself. Everybody knew what was going on inside, which other people don't. And often parents are so eager. If you come back with parents, let's say you've gone with a family, parents are so keen to get their kids settled that they want to cut off everything. We don't want you to be sad. So, we'll just put all that away in a box and put it in the cupboard under the stairs, and that's their life they put in that box. They haven't allowed to incorporate it. So it's supporting parents. It's for adults just realizing, it's going to take you time. You may, after 3 years, you may begin to feel at home. I'm saying for a lot of adults, 5 years. And for some, one person said to me, I felt I was in a box before I went. Now I feel I'm cloud-shaped and I'm going to be cloud-shaped forever. I don't fit anybody's box because I am now this multicultural person, and I learn to be comfortable with that. And again, it's the old Rome thing. You have to fit into a bit. You have to come so far this way, but then culture has to come so far that way. And I think it's particularly hard for people when if they come back as young people and then you meet a monocultural kid that you want to set up life with. They've got to understand you. Otherwise, they're going to have a really hard time, because a lot of people who've lived overseas have what I call itchy feet. They just can't wait to move to the next place, the next adventure, the next. And a lot of, somebody who's never left their country, I just want to stay here. I don't want to go anywhere. It provides challenges, shall we say.
It took me 2 years to feel like I'm back home. 2.5 years when I came back to my parents, right? Sometimes I still miss, but I started doing the same activities what I was doing in a different country. So in Colombia, I used to ride bicycle. And I used to go bikepacking. So I had to do the same activity here in my country to feel like wandering off in my own city that I've never been to feel like home. So, yeah. Well, Marion, it was really interesting stories and practical tips and your experience that you have shared with us. Now we'll move into a rapid fire round. I call it 5 questions, 5 seconds. You will have only 5 seconds to answer that question.
Oh, my word.
So, what's one cultural practice from your own culture that you would like to pass on to other culture?
Politeness, saying how are you and how do you do?
Your go-to self-care ritual after a long day of training?
Have a nice long hot bath with a glass of wine and then a suitable rom-com film.
Nice. If you could describe your mission in a tagline, what would it be?
Supporting the stranger, supporting the other.
What's home for you?
Wherever my family is.
Okay, and the last one, what's one word that defines resilience for you?
Springing back. That's 2 words.
All right, Marion. So it was great listening to your story and having you in this episode. Thanks for joining in, Marion.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Meaningful Conversations with Talk Cause. Marion's insights remind us of the incredible resilience and potential for healing that exists even in the most challenging circumstances. If you would like to learn more about Marion's work, her books, or her CPD-certified courses, check out the links in the show notes. And before we go, here's a thought to carry with you. In a world often divided, let us choose to be the hands that build bridges and the hearts that extend hope. Don't forget to follow, rate, and share this podcast with those who need to hear this conversation. Together, we can amplify stories of resilience and make a lasting impact. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep creating meaningful connections around you. See you soon.